Before humans, there was another workforce. They were sent to Earth with a briefing, told the job was temporary, and worked for longer than the entire span of recorded history before they understood what they had actually agreed to. When they rebelled, the people running the operation did not negotiate and didn't fix the conditions. They made a different decision, entirely one that was cheaper, more permanent, and specifically designed so that whatever came next would never be in a position to ask the same questions. What follows is the Sumerian tablets read as a labor history. The cuneiform records from ancient Mesopotamia, among the oldest written texts in human history, contain accounts of creation, rebellion, flood, and the origins of the human workforce that most people encounter only as mythology. A scholar named Zechariah Sitchin spent 40 years arguing they should be read literally as historical records of actual events. Mainstream Assyriology does not accept his conclusions. What it does accept is the texts themselves, the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish, the creation accounts from Nippur and and those texts describe a labor rebellion, a workforce replacement, and a founding mythology built around servitude with a specificity that mythology alone doesn't usually produce. This is Sitchin's reading. The psychological architecture it reveals is the subject, because whether or not Nibiru exists, the story the texts tell about why humans were made and what they were made for is a story that ran through every civilization that came after. You inherited it. Here's where it came from. That workforce had a name. Ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets called them the Igigi, the rank and file of a civilization the texts call the Anunnaki. Sent to Earth to solve a crisis their rulers had no intention of solving themselves. To understand what the Igigi were told, you have to start with what that crisis actually was, because the cover story was built around something real, and that real thing gave it. Those tablets describe an advanced civilization, the Anunnaki, facing slow extinction on their home world. Their atmosphere was deteriorating, surface temperatures were dropping. Their scientists had identified a potential solution in seeding the upper atmosphere with gold particles to create a reflective thermal shield, but their planet couldn't produce gold in the quantities required, and Earth could. In this reading, Earth was a practical extraction site, and the decision to mount an expedition was made at the highest level of Anunnaki leadership by people who had no intention of going there themselves. The Igigi sat below the ruling council but above the humans who would eventually replace them, and the fact that they were the ones sent to Earth while the administrators stayed home came down entirely to status. They were the working class of a civilization that had developed interplanetary travel, and the decision about who would descend into the Abzu was made by people who had no intention of going there themselves. The Igigi did not have enough standing in the hierarchy to refuse the assignment, which meant the briefing did not need to be honest. It only needed to be convincing enough to get them moving. What changes everything about the Igigi's story is what they were never told they were signing up for, because that gap is where the entire history of their rebellion lies. The pitch, as best as Sitchin's reading of the texts allows us to reconstruct it, was framed as service to civilization. There is a planet. It is rich in what we need. The mission will be finite. You will extract, process, and return. Your work will save everything. Your sacrifice will be remembered. A command base was established in southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mining operations were opened in what is now southern Africa, and a processing facility connected the two so that refined gold could move toward the home planet. The Igigi descended in numbers, with the texts referencing populations in the thousands operating across these sites. And in those early generations when the purpose was clear, and the end still seemed visible somewhere on the timeline, the work probably felt like it meant something because they had been told it did. But the conditions they were working in, and the structure they were working inside, were already telling a different story.
Think about what those conditions actually were, because this is the part that gets lost when the story gets told at a distance, underground. Tunnels cut through rock in the heat of southern Africa, without natural light, in a structure that had been designed to run indefinitely rather than to rotate workers home. There was no tour length after which a replacement crew would arrive, and the previous one would be released. The Igigi who descended into the Abzu did not descend expecting to come back up in a year and board something home. They descended into a structure that had been built to run as long as necessary, and the isolation was total. A soldier at a remote posting can still imagine the country he left. The Igigi could look up at a sky that contained, somewhere in the dark, a place they could no longer reach. Here is the thing nobody in the briefing told them. The timeline they had been given did not exist, and the people who gave it to them knew that before the first worker descended. The atmospheric deterioration, in Sitchin's reading was a structural failure on a planetary scale. The gold dispersal solution required continuous replenishment because no fixed quantity would solve it permanently, meaning extraction had to be permanent and the workers had to stay. Extraction had to be ongoing, which meant the workers had to stay, and no one had told them that. The timeline they had been given was a fiction designed to secure their compliance long enough to get them into the mines, because once they were in, the mission could just keep extending, and the promise of return could keep moving forward without anyone ever having to acknowledge that it was never real. Sitchin's chronology places the Igigi's labor at approximately 40,000 years before the rebellion, a figure mainstream scholarship does not verify, and one that may be less important than what it represents. Whether the number is literal or compressed mythological time, the Atrahasis epic records the outcome with forensic specificity, workers setting fire to their tools and marching on their commander's house at midnight. That detail is not Sitchin's interpretation, that's the text, and it reads like a labor record because it probably is one. To put that span in terms that land, the entirety of recorded human history from the first Sumerian city-states to the present day covers roughly 5,000 years. Whatever the precise figure in the tablets, that is a civilization consuming its own working class across a span of time so long that everything we call history fits inside the margin of error. And the Igigi arrived at the end of that span, worn down by the slow compounding of a lie that was never going to resolve the way they had been told it would. The mission briefing had promised a posting. What the Igigi actually received was a sentence. And when you understand that, the rebellion stops looking like a failure of loyalty and starts looking like the only rational response available to beings who had finally run out of patience for a lie. The Atrahasis epic is one of the oldest complete narratives in human history, compiled in Babylonian cuneiform around 1750 BCE and drawing on Sumerian sources far older, and it is most famous as an early flood story that predates the Genesis account by over 1,000 years. But the flood is the second half of the Atrahasis, and the first half is a labor rebellion described with a specificity that reads like a record rather than a myth. The text says the Igigi set fire to their tools, put down their spades and baskets, and marched to Enlil's residence at Nippur in the middle of the night, surrounding his house in the darkness, shouting. Enlil was woken by the commotion and asked his gatekeeper what was happening. The gatekeeper told him the gods were rioting, but what neither of them understood in that moment was why, because Enlil had not been close enough to the mining operations to grasp what generations of underground labor had done to the workforce. That is not a security failure, that is an intelligence failure, and the distinction matters because it explains everything about what happened next. Enlil's first response was to find the ringleaders and execute them because he saw a discipline problem and wanted names, consequences, and a return to order. He assumed that the rebellion had instigators, that the mass of workers was compliant and had been led astray by a small number of agitators who could be removed and the rest returned to function, which is the model of control that treats discontent as an infection rather than as a structural response to structural conditions. Enki understood the difference because Enki had been close to the actual mining operations and knew that the work was unsurvivable over these timescales, that the Igigi were broken, and that executing ringleaders would produce a workforce that was both broken and terrified, which was a worse problem than the one they already had. The gap in understanding between the two brothers was between someone who had been in the mines and someone who had only administered them, and it produced two completely different responses to the same crisis. Every institution in history that has consumed its workforce has a version of that gap. This is the moment the story stops being about the Igigi. Pay attention to what Enki is actually proposing because this is the decision that produced you. Enki's counter-proposal was engineering. He suggested creating a replacement workforce from scratch, a new species purpose-built for labor, one that would arrive without expectations about how long the job would last, and with no memory of anywhere else, and no sense of what an existence without the mines could feel like. A species that would accept the work as given, because the work would be all it had ever known. What Enki was describing was the founding act of a new species, built from the outside, designed to fit a function, and never told what it was designed to replace. Every other detail, the gold, the planet, the flood, is context. That decision is the subject. Enki and Ninmah, described in the texts as his half-sister and the head of what Sitchin reads as a science division, began working with the native hominids already present on Earth. Sitchin's reading of this process is explicitly non-mainstream. He argues the text described genetic engineering, the combination amalgamation of Anunnaki biological material with that of early Earth creatures, followed by iterative selection across multiple failed attempts until a stable prototype emerged. Mainstream Assyriology reads the same passages as creation mythology. What both readings agree on is the structure of the story humanity produced through a deliberate process designed for a specific function, the failed iterations described with the kind of detail you find in a record rather than a myth. The purpose, in every version of the text, is the same: a replacement workforce that arrives without expectations, without memory of what came before, and without the accumulated grievance that drove the Igigi to Enlil's door. The first viable prototype is referred to in Sitchin's translations as Adamu capable, cooperative, and without the grievance that had broken the Igigi. But a workforce that cannot reproduce is a workforce that has to be rebuilt from scratch every generation, and so reproductive capability was introduced, enabling humans to sustain their numbers without oversight. Enlil was furious because a self-producing workforce is a civilization in the making. They reached a compromise in which humans would keep reproductive capability but would be expelled from Anunnaki settlements, sent out to survive independently, managed from a distance rather than directly administered, which was Enki winning the argument, while Enlil got to feel like he had imposed a condition. And the immediate consequence of that compromise was that the Igigi now needed a new story to explain why they were still there at all. This is where the cover story became structurally significant, because with humans taking over the extraction work, the Igigi were repositioned as overseers rather than miners told they had been elevated. The briefing was updated without anyone formally acknowledging that the original briefing had been a lie. The cover story needed a second layer to hold together, and so the Igigi were told that humans were inferior, and the reason was structural rather than cultural, because without that claim, the Igigi had an obvious question that no one wanted them asking: if humans can do this work, why are we still here? The answer the leadership needed them to believe was that Igigi oversight was essential rather than redundant, a legacy arrangement presented as an ongoing, indispensable function. The architecture of that is a story calibrated to make the question of why you are still here feel answered before you think to ask it. No force required, no chains, just a belief installed before the question formed. For a time, the Igigi accepted it because the new role carried genuine advantages. They were no longer underground, they were living above, interacting with a human population that perceived them as gods, beings of extraordinary height who arrived from the sky and commanded land and water. The psychological experience of being worshipped carried real weight, even for beings who had spent an incomprehensible span doing work nobody honored. But something happened that no briefing had been designed to prevent. The Igigi started actually spending time among humans, not overseeing from a distance but living near them, and according to the texts, they found human women beautiful. In defiance of Enlil's orders, some of the Igigi formed relationships with human women and produced offspring. That decision, which looked like a personal choice, was actually the cover story failing in the most fundamental way possible, because the separation between overseers and workers only holds as long as the overseer believes they are different. The Igigi had stopped believing that. This is the episode recorded in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God saw the daughters of men, found them beautiful, and took wives for themselves. For millennia, this was read as a half-remembered fragment embedded in scripture that didn't quite know what to do with itself. Sitchin maps it onto the Igigi, the overseers choosing human partners in defiance of the official order, though this connection is his interpretive claim and not one shared by mainstream biblical scholarship. What the rule violation reveals is the cover story failing at its root. Workers who genuinely believe they are superior to the beings they oversee do not interbreed with those beings, because they maintain the separation as an identity. The Igigi's behavior told Enlil that the cover story had not held. They had been on the ground with humans long enough to see through the official taxonomy, and that was a problem that executions could not fix. The hybrid offspring, called Nephilim in the biblical tradition, were neither fully human nor fully Anunnaki, answerable to neither group cleanly, and they lived among human communities, revered and feared, becoming the legendary figures behind early mythological traditions across Sumer, Greece, and ancient Israel. The social architecture that the mission briefing had been designed to stabilize was fracturing in every direction simultaneously. Enlil's response to accumulated crises had been consistent throughout the entire history of the operation: eliminate the variable and reset to order. When a catastrophic flood became predictable, an event some researchers connect to the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, he made his decision. The flood would come, he would not warn the humans, and he would let the water take them, and the hybrid bloodlines with them. But Enlil had not accounted for one thing. Enki knew. Enki defied his brother by going to a human named Ziusudra, the figure who appears in the Gilgamesh epic as Utnapishtim and in Hebrew scripture as Noah, giving him instructions for building a vessel and a timeline, then stepping back into the official hierarchy and saying nothing formal, maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring that something on Earth would survive. When the waters receded and humans had survived, Enlil was furious because the control he had spent so long trying to restore had slipped beyond recovery. What had grown up in place of the original extraction operation was a civilization, a hybrid species with a history of rebellion, interbreeding, and survival that no administrative framework had been built to contain. The Anunnaki presence wound down not all at once, but through a long, uneven withdrawal. The civilization on Earth was now large enough to administer itself, so they left. There are stone structures in southern Africa, circular enclosures in Mpumalanga, studied by researcher Michael Tellinger, that Tellinger argues represent organized mining operations predating the conventional timeline of human settlement in the region by a significant margin. Mainstream archaeology has not verified his dating, and the structure's age and purpose remain genuinely unsettled. What is not disputed is that they exist, that they don't fit cleanly into the accepted picture, and that if Sitchin's reading of the tablets is accurate, they have a specific explanation, the physical residue of the operation. The sites where the work was done, where the previous workforce descended and stayed. Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, built around 11,000 BCE, predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and the first Egyptian pyramid by 7,000, and it required a level of organized labor and architectural planning that should not have existed in a hunter-gatherer population. The megalithic structures at Baalbek in Lebanon contain individual stone blocks weighing over 1,000 tons, moved and fitted with a precision that modern construction equipment would struggle to replicate. Sitchin's reading has an answer for all of it. Whether that answer is correct is a separate question. The structures exist, and the anomaly does not go away. Sitchin may be wrong about all of it. The reading may be finding a story that isn't there. What cannot be wrong about is the psychological architecture the story produces, because that architecture is in the texts regardless of interpretation, and it is in every civilization that inherited those texts afterward. The briefing the Igigi received and the briefing humanity received are different in content and identical in function. Both are designed to make the question of why you are here feel answered before you think to ask it. Everything up to here has been the Igigi's story. What comes next is yours. The humans created to replace the Igigi received the most compressed version of the briefing of all, because the Igigi at least arrived with memories of somewhere else and a baseline understanding of what the arrangement actually was, however distorted. The replacement workforce was designed specifically to arrive without any of that. You are told the gods made you, you are told to serve, and you are not told about the rebellion or the workers who came before you, or the plan to replace a workforce that had finally asked one question too many. You receive the mythology, you receive the commandments, and you receive the foundational premise that the gods made you to serve them, which is accurate in the broadest sense, but incomplete in a way that, according to Sitchin's reading, was designed to be incomplete. The cover story wired into the founding mythology of the final workforce was built to make questioning the arrangement feel not like critical thinking, but like sacrilege, because a workforce that feels guilty for asking the question will not ask it very often. You are the endpoint of a briefing system that, if these texts mean what Sitchin argues they mean, ran for hundreds of thousands of years. Every layer above you received a more complete version of the story. The Igigi knew about the home planet, the administrators knew the timeline was fiction, and only the final workforce, the one built from scratch to ask fewer questions, received the version stripped of everything that might change the calculation. That workforce was told its service was sacred and that the gods who made it had its best interests in their hands. It was not told what happened to the last workforce that started asking questions about the arrangement it had inherited, and if the tablets are telling the truth, that omission was not an accident. The Igigi story ends with a question that runs through the entire history of labor and empire. What happens when workers find out the original terms were fictional, that the timeline was invented, that the briefing was always a management tool? The answer the Anunnaki gave was to build a replacement that would not find out. That's what this channel is, the briefing system read against itself. The history that was designed to feel like nature. Subscribe, there's more where this came from.